Welcome to episode 107 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. I can think back easily to a lot of books I enjoyed reading as a child. The Boxcar Children, Fudge, the Goosebump Series. I could get lost in these books because I felt so connected to the characters. Dare I say, I identified with them? Yeah, I could definitely say that because often I did. Which is why I never considered that so many grow up not getting to say the same thing. My guest today is one of them. Shetal Shah has been in and around education for many years. One thing she noticed was the lack of books in the classroom featuring Indian or Indian American women like herself. As a former history teacher at an all-girls school, Shetal witnessed how curriculum and literature inclusive of women from diverse backgrounds can have a positive impact on girls' self-esteem, identity development, and belonging. She knew what she had to do. She decided to write her own book titled Shakti Girls. She chose the Hindi word Shakti for the title because it means feminine energy and strength, power, and a force to be reckoned with. I am excited to welcome Shetal today to talk more about her book and why we need to see more inclusive curriculum of many cultures. Shetal, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm excited to have you. I'm excited to talk about this book and that you've written, but also to learn a little bit more about you. And if you don't mind, that's where I'd like to get started today to find out a little bit more about you for our guests and how you became anchored in education.
Sure. Well, a few things about me while I was growing up. There were a few things that I loved doing. I loved reading and I loved writing. So I often had my nose in a book or writing in my journal in all kinds of formats, poetry, creative writing. I thought one day I wanted to be a songwriter, so I tried to write songs. So I spent a lot of my time doing that, but I also spent a lot of my time starting in ninth grade tutoring. I remember it was early ninth grade in high school, and my high school principal sought me out in the hallways, and he was like, "Shetal, I think I have a job for you." And I was like, "A job? I didn't even know I was looking for a job." and he's like, "I know you've done some volunteering over the summer, and I know a student in the elementary school. He's in fifth grade, and he could use some support with his reading and writing and homework. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And before I knew it, I was really enjoying working with this student one-on-one a few times a week during the school year and into the summer as well.
Okay.
Through most of high school. I took some breaks junior year to focus on the SATs. But so I spent a lot of my time in high school tutoring. And then when I went to college, I continued working with young children outside of my course load. So I volunteered at daycare centers, with local nonprofits. I went to school in New York City. I went to NYU. So there were definitely a lot of spaces around the school and the village area where I could, volunteer and work with children. So I kept at it as something I enjoyed doing on the side. And then I continued doing it then after college. After, I started working in the corporate world, I was working as a marketing manager from 9 to 5. And then I would spend my evenings volunteering for the Fresh Air Fund or through Big Brother, Big Sister, either mentoring or working as a tutor. And I loved it. And I loved it so much that when I reached 25, like sort of a quarter life crisis, I really felt that urge and that call to teach. I mean, I think it was already inside of me, but I was realizing that I love what I do so much outside of my 9 to 5 job that I needed to make that pivot. And so I listened to that voice inside of my head that I think was screaming at me for a long time, and followed that hobby and pursued it as a career.
Wow. I love how the beginning of the anchoring goes all the way back to whenever you were in high school, and has just stayed with you. And it's funny how, even when we try to avoid, and not necessarily avoid, but when we try to go down a different path, if we're destined to be somewhere, it's interesting how it pulls us back, as it did to you. And I love quarter life crisis. And in fact, I'm thinking, like, we've got all of these fractions out there. Why do we just reserve it for midlife? Like, maybe I'm going through like a 3/10. But it's, excuse me, as we hear about how you became anchored in education, you now have combined your love for education and going all the way back to your love of writing to where you have now recently published a book, and it's titled Shakti Girls, which is a collection of poems of inspiring Indian women. Now, this book includes representations of over 10 different industries, such as women in science, politics, math, activism, and sports. What else can you tell listeners about this book and the influences your career as a teacher and administrator had in writing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Shakti Girls, it's, a compilation. It's a collection of poems about these remarkable women from India. Many of these women I didn't even know about until recently or much later in life. So I didn't grow up knowing their names. And so as an educator, when I started teaching, I started teaching both in public and then later in private, and taught in co-ed, but spent predominantly my teaching years teaching in girls' schools.
Okay.
And working with students, from various backgrounds. And so I learned really early on in my my career as an educator, the value of bringing diversity and inclusion into the curriculum, and the value of diverse and inclusive literature, and that having students be able to see themselves represented in what they're learning and what they're reading is such a critical part of their academic engagement, their sense of belonging, their self-esteem. All of that has an impact on how they see themselves as students and how they see themselves as part of society. And so I learned really early on in my career as a teacher that this is important, but yet there is such a lack of diverse representation in children's books, in literature, in curriculum, and in textbooks. I think in the children's book industry, 70% of books are still mainly centered around white protagonists or animals. Mm-hmm. And so, there has been progress made, but we still have a long way to go. And within that, there are very few books that tell the story of South Asians. Very few nonfiction books that really celebrate the leaders from this region, particularly women. And so that played that realization really played a critical role in me figuring out what it was I wanted to write about. And then, the book I wrote the stories about these phenomenal women. I wrote them in rhyme, I wrote them in poetry, and that came directly from my experience as an educator. I did a fellowship on brain-based teaching strategies, pedagogy. And I did a little experiment in the classroom. My students were really flexible and awesome about this. I remember that year I had them do all kinds of things. And and so I remember doing an experiment where I taught the content, and then I had them do activities where they had to create poems or or rhyming, like rhyming poems or stories about what they had learned to see if it impacted their ability to then, demonstrate their learning and be able to memorize it or, regurgitate it in some way. And, I found just in that study, it's a little study that I did,
Yeah.
that there were some cognitive benefits to rhyme when in memory and engagement. It was more enjoyable as an activity. It was more enjoyable for them to learn, and it really did. Those patterns and those sounds really play a role in your ability to remember. So I recall that experience, and then as well as the literature I've read on the benefits of rhyme. So I knew that I wanted to write this book, write the stories in rhyme to really help the readers. It's the young readers stay engaged.
Yeah.
And in biographies, these are real stories. So I wanted them to be interesting. I wanted them to read a book that read like many other picture books that they were familiar with, like Llama Llama and other goose rhymes. I wanted to have a similar sound.
Yeah.
And then I also included a hidden object activity for each portrait in the book. The book is beautifully illustrated by now a friend of mine. We've gotten to know each other really well this past year, Kavitha Rajput. And we worked together on putting in objects into each portrait so that they served as visual cues for the reader, so they can make connections between these objects and how they connect to the women. So, for example, one of the women I wrote about, her name is Geeta Phogat. She is a groundbreaking wrestler from India, one of the first woman, female wrestler from India to go to the Olympics. So incredibly inspiring story. She's from a small village in northern India, and she had to use bricks to lift weight and prepare and train. And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, what a story of resilience.
Yeah.
And passion, right? And perseverance. And so I included that in the poem. And then one of the objects that the readers have to find is a brick in the portrait. And to make, to kind of to make that connection and to, make a deeper connection on, oh my gosh. I'm so sorry.
No, you're quite all right.
That was my mom. So that they can make a deeper connection between the visual cue and the woman. And then finally, at the end of the book, there is a space for reflection and journaling. And I kind of see that as the exit ticket to my lesson, right? I think the teachers know what an exit ticket is. Something where they can hand in at the end of their lesson that helps them, forge those connections and give them a chance to apply themselves into what they learned in that lesson. And so the space for reflection and journaling really solidifies, what they learned about the women, but also allowing them to, giving them the space to then dive into their inner Shakti, their inner strength and power.
Yeah, and it absolutely is a beautifully illustrated book. And so just a couple follow-ups listening to that. So whose idea was it to put the hidden pictures in there? Was that something that you had from the very beginning you wanted to do, or was that through collaboration with the illustrator?
That was something I had in the back of my mind for a long time. I think when I first came up with the idea of the book, I knew I wanted to have sort of an interactive component. And so that was definitely an idea that I had. And so working with the illustrator and figuring out how to weave that in was the collaboration piece.
Okay. And so you write the poetry in couplets, and I believe is the poetic terminology for that. How difficult was it to to get that rhyme scheme going for each of these poems? Because whenever I went through them, of course they're unique because you're talking about a different influential figure, but just I think the writing of that has to be so complex.
Yeah, it was really hard.
Okay, all right.
I don't take that oh gosh, poetry is so challenging, and to have it, I really wanted it to be like consistent 10, 11 syllables
Yeah.
per line, and I was singing and clapping. My children can tell you all kinds of silly stories around that. But yeah, it was definitely really challenging. But for me, the process really began with the research, because I really wanted the content to be there. And once again, that's the teacher in me. I wanted the stories to have the information first. And so I did the research first. I developed the questions that I wanted each poem to answer first. And I actually developed the questions with help from my beta readers. So help from readers that would be in my target audience, young readers, and I also asked some fellow teacher friends. So I sort of asked my audience, what kind of questions or answers would you be looking for? And then I did my research, found the content, and then I wrote the poems in prose.
Okay.
First.
Oh.
And then once I had the poems laid out and there was a flow, so there was a beginning, a middle, details, and an end, then I went back and worked on how do I get the poems to rhyme and have a flow to it. That made the process, breaking it down into those steps, made it more manageable for me, and definitely made it a lot easier. But it's definitely challenging, and there was definitely a lot of creativity involved.
Well, I tell you what, I love finding the behind the scenes, the breakdown of all of it. The final product is just it's amazing to me. And so, listening to all of that, you can clearly see how being an educator had a tremendous influence on you in writing this book. But I know that life always has a great way of lending itself to our inspiration as well. So I'm wondering, can we spend a few minutes talking about your experiences growing up in America as a second-generation Indian American, as well as what you hope now, as a mother, that you're raising two children of your own and what, their experiences are?
Sure. So my parents, they immigrated to the United States from Gujarat, India in the 1970s. And I was born and raised in New York. I spent almost all of my childhood, 80s, 90s, growing up in New York, and I did my undergraduate and graduate work there as well. And so growing up in the United States as a second generation Indian or Indian American, I really did not see a lot of my heritage or identity represented in mainstream media, in the books that I read, in the shows or movies that I watched. And I honestly didn't even know or see or know about a lot of the women that I wrote about in the book until much later in life. I've been asked, what South Asian book in your childhood, had a lot of influence on you. And I draw a blank.
Yeah.
I really didn't have any growing up except for some religious texts. And so, I learned about Indira Gandhi, in high school. She was the first female prime minister of India, one of the first female political leaders in the world. And I didn't know about her until much later. And even then it was a small little snapshot in my textbook. And then I didn't read my first novel written by a South Asian writer until I was a high school senior. So I spent most of my childhood, not really seeing myself in books. And so when I did start learning about these women and these role models, I remember that feeling of, oh my gosh, they get me. Like Jhumpa Lahiri in her novel Interpreter of Maladies, I felt like she captured my experience and in a way told my story, and told the story of so many other Indian Americans. And it was the first time I felt like I wasn't an exception to the American story. And I was part of the American story. And I just remember that feeling of belonging, right? And so when I think about that childhood experience of not seeing myself and then seeing myself, I really wanted to create that for my own children, right?
Sure.
And I often wonder what would have happened, what impact would have had on me had I learned about these women, these role models at a younger age. I was a really quiet kid outside of my home. I was loud and boisterous.
Isn't that how it goes?
But at school, I really struggled to raise my hand and find, I kind of just lived in this place of discomfort outside of my home. And so I wonder, like, had I had these access to these role models and their stories at a younger age, would I have found my voice sooner? Would I have felt more confident in my full self at a younger age? And would I have spent more time embracing my true interests in liberal arts and education instead of feeling the pressure to like fit a mold and excel in other areas like science and math that weren't really of interest to me, but I felt like I had to do really well in those areas to, meet certain expectations of society. And it's kind of like I often think about what Billie Jean King, the tennis champion, says about, the importance of being able to see it, to be it. And had I known about, many of these amazing women at a younger age, I probably would have known that my options were a lot more broader and, exhaustive in a way.
Sure.
And I realized that there were at the time. And so when I became a mom, I think that really put the pressure on me to tap into sort of the dormant creative side, although I feel like education and being a teacher is also a very creative job. But to really tap into my love for writing and do something about the diversity gap that still continues in children's literature, specifically addressing the gap with nonfiction, books for children celebrating South Asian leaders. And I'm raising two boys, but I feel like as a mom raising two boys, I also have a responsibility to expose them to the stories of women and to help break down any sort of unconscious bias they have about women and female identifying, of what they're capable of, and so that I raise them to be advocates of gender equality. And so I want them to also be inspired by these books, but I also want them to use it as a way to, to be leaders when they step into their adulthood for gender equality.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you sharing, more on your experience and growing up. It's a great segue into, where I want to go next in this conversation. But, there's a small part of me now that I just wish that maybe we would have answered that phone call from your mom and talk to her as well. So maybe we can have a follow up on that. But no, now you've been quoted saying, quote, "You wrote Shakti Girls just as much for yourself as you did for the next generation to feel empowered to step into their authentic selves and defy the notion to fit a mold," close quote. This book is more than just picking influential Indian women and writing about them. You told us about your meticulous research on each influential character that shines through with each poem, and really what you were kind of hoping would be the takeaway we had heard from whenever, maybe this was available when you were a kid. So now I'm wondering, now that you've written it, what do you hope readers take away from reading Shakti Girls?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, it was incredibly cathartic to create something that I needed as a kid. I think that process was healing. It was also cathartic knowing that the book is part of a solution to an issue that needs addressing. And so, it helped me see myself as someone who's helping to solve a problem, but then also helping by inspiring the next generation. And so I was just as much inspired by the stories of these women myself, especially during the process when I would get stuck, and their stories reminded me to push through, and to get to
Hmm.
the finish line. And so I hope readers, they walk away from this book also feeling inspired to, by their stories of resilience, their stories of following their passion and dreams. And I hope my readers can walk away feeling that they too can also achieve their goals, like the women in this book who used their inner Shakti and listened to it. I want my readers to see that, they too can ignite that Shakti what's in them, and that it's unique and it's their own individual Shakti that they can follow and listen to. And so, especially for girls and girls of color who are often underrepresented in the literature that they read, I think there is, lessons to be learned from these women that can inspire any child. For readers who don't identify as South Asian or Indian, I think there is a great amount to be learned by, reading and hearing the stories of those that live differently from them. There's much to be gained from those stories, and there's actually a lot of commonality as well. And so I hope, readers walk away feeling inspired, but I also hope they walk away feeling curious and
Hmm.
appreciative of the diverse cultures and people around the world.
Yeah, and I know that each of the poems had that research, but I found myself after reading one wanting to seek out more information that maybe you couldn't include in the poem, and so I hope others find that same drive, because there was so much I didn't know, and it was wonderful to be learn more about the Indian women that you wrote about and the things that they did and all the careers that were in there. So before we go, you published Shakti Girls to help fill a gap on underrepresented Indian women. We we have a long way to go, though. I've heard there is a possible follow-up to Shakti Girls down the road. I'm wondering for my listeners today, first of all, will we maybe see a sequel? And second, what can we all do to give better representation to those who have been, left out or forgotten in our history?
Yeah, great question. But yes, circling back to the sequel, I'm definitely working on the second installment of Shakti Girls. I've done several school visits, and I always ask the students, who would you like to see in the next Shakti Girls? And I love the ideas and I love hearing their input. And so, as I mentioned before, getting feedback from the audience and shaping how the book, should be written. I'm already in that process right now, and I've started doing some research, and I'm excited. There are so many stories to be told, and I'm definitely excited to bring more women from history, from India's rich history, into the next book. But in terms of, what can we do to give better representation of those left out or forgotten in our history? I'll say for teachers, I think what really helped me was kind of going in with the assumption that the curriculum, the curriculum or the book, there are voices that are left out. There are stories that are forgotten.
Yes.
And then asking the question, okay, who are these people that are not part of this conversation and story? What are those stories? Right. And so always having that question in the back of your mind then becomes the spark, that reminder that we have to then make space in the curriculum and really be intentional about including those stories into the curriculum, right? And I think if we have that in the back of our mind, then we can start making that space in our curriculum to do it. And one thing I loved doing was asking the students, who do you think is left out of the story of the American Revolution, for example? And I'm telling you, this generation, this new wave of young learners, they're on it. Like, they are probably more aware than, us older folks. And so they are curious about the unsung heroes and the forgotten stories, and giving space for them to ask the questions, giving them space to do the research, and then bring those stories to the unit, to the curriculum, I think can have a really profound impact on shaping the way they learn and see the world, really giving the students voice and choice in how they want to learn the content. I think can be a really powerful way in bringing in stories that have been forgotten.
Yes, and I love that you mention the giving students voice and choice. I think that is critical if we want to engage our children. I think we can learn so much from our students. For any educator out there listening that's wondering, how do we begin to create that space? Might I recommend visiting the link on today's website to pick up their copy of Shakti Girls, Poems of Inspiring Indian Women. Shetal, it has been so much of a pleasure to talk more about this today, and thank you for joining us on Anchored in Education.
Thank you so much. This was great. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Now, you can read more about Shetal on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. You can also find links to all her social media, as well as a link to pick up your copy of Shakti Girls today. And don't forget, if you haven't already, subscribe to this podcast, give it 5 stars, talk about how you love it, share it with your friends, do whatever you can to promote far and wide on whatever platform you get your podcasts. I want to reflect back on Shetal talking about not seeing herself in literature and throughout the curriculum as she was growing up. If many of us are honest, you will admit, as I did in the beginning, that we don't have firsthand experiences to what Shetal is talking about. While we may not have control over that, we do have control over promoting, lifting up, and supporting other cultures in our curriculum so that students within our schools and districts don't feel unimportant or unseen. I cannot imagine going through schools, reading text after text, only to realize that once again, the character doesn't look like you or come from your background. I recently taught a class in which we discussed how mission statements often say all children somewhere in it. It's now time to double down on all, then. If all truly means all, then you need to make sure that in your district, in your schools, and in your classrooms, you have available texts that allow all students to see themselves represented. Allowing everyone the opportunity to see themselves represented is what helps keep us anchored in education.